Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Daniela Bleichmar. I teach art history and history here at USC, and it is my pleasure to welcome Claire Farago to USC. Today's lecture has been organized by the Levan Institute for the Humanities, but it is a collaboration among the Levan Institute Environmental Humanities Working Group, the Department of Art History, the Visual Studies Research Institute, the Wrigley Institute for Environment and Sustainability, and the EMSI Visual and Material Culture Seminar. So my thanks to everyone who so enthusiastically supported this program, and in particular to Levan Associate Director Zach Mann for seamless organization, and to Levan Director Rebecca Lemon. Claire Farago is Professor Emerita at the University of Colorado Boulder, where she taught for 30 years. She has held various visiting distinguished professorships, including at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, UCLA, the University of Melbourne, the University of York, the University of Zurich, and Smith College, where she was Ruth and Clarence Kennedy Professor in Renaissance Studies in 2021. She has received fellowships from the Getty Research Institute, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Fulbright Foundation, the Folger Library. I could go on. Farago has published widely on art theory and historiography, transcultural studies, the materiality of the sacred, the history of style, on museums and collecting practices. She's a specialist on the manuscripts of Leonardo da Vinci, on which she is a worldwide authority. Her recent book, The Fabrication of Leonardo da Vinci's Trattato della Pittura, from 2018, is a product of a 15-year collaboration with an international team of Leonardo scholars. In addition to working at the very heart of the discipline of art history, Farago has been a pioneer and a leader in expanding the work of art history. She edited the groundbreaking anthology Reframing the Renaissance, published in 1995, which opened the field of transcultural studies in Anglophone art history. The award-winning volume Transforming Images, New Mexican Santos in Between Worlds from 2006 was a collaborative project co-authored with Donna Pierce and other contributors that she developed with students, along with an award-winning exhibition at the University of Colorado. She also developed two collaborative transcultural projects with Donald Preziosi intended for a broad academic audience: the edited volume Grasping the World, the Idea of the Museum from 2004, and the co-authored Art is Not What You Think It Is from 2012. Her latest line of research investigates the history of human exceptionalism as a key factor contributing to the environmental crisis and suggests a new path forward for the study of the history of art. This research has yielded two books published this year. One is an anthology co-edited with Susan Loesch and Jens Baumgarten entitled Transcultural Histories of Art and Artisanal Epistemologies, Knowledge to be Made, and also the book Writing Borderless Histories of Art, Human Exceptionalism, and the Climate Crisis, about which she will talk today. Please join me in welcoming Claire Farago.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniela, for that very generous, maybe too generous introduction. I much appreciate it. Thank you all for coming at 5 o'clock at the end of a long day for this talk. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the Levan Environmental Studies Working Group and the other sponsors that I won't repeat because Daniela just gave them all out. But I'm especially thankful to have such an interdisciplinary audience that's interested in environmental studies and ecological issues. So I came to writing this book, Writing Borderless Histories of Art, in 2017, right after Trump was elected president. And I wanted to write something for a broad audience about the state of the planet, that was drawing upon my specific expertise, which is in the intellectual history of the Western idea of art. And I thought that that was the place that I could make a contribution. I didn't want this book to be just for specialists. I write a lot of things just for specialists. The Leonardo da Vinci material is mostly for specialists. But I wanted to use that knowledge. I had no idea how much I would need to learn to be able to write this book. So what I thought was going to be a 2-year project as I transitioned from teaching full-time to life as an independent scholar in my retirement turned out to be a 6-year project. But along the way, I also published, with the help of Susan and Jens, this anthology, which is kind of a sequel or a parallel to the book itself, because this book, and maybe I'll have time at the end to say a few words, but I'm not sure. This book is the result of a conference of the International Congress of the History of Art, and it was held in 2022 after being postponed due to the pandemic in Sao Paulo. And this call for papers was for people who wanted to think transculturally about art history together with the category artisanal epistemology, which had been introduced by historians of science to try to broaden what we think of, especially in the early modern world, as art and science before those categories really existed. We didn't tell people what we wanted. We wanted to see what they came up with, and we have a wonderful volume. As I say, I may get back to it before, but unusually, all the people in this book, there are 11 chapters, selected themselves because they all submitted proposals to the conference. So let me tell you a little bit about the book as a book, but most of my talk is really the argument of the book, a kind of taste of the book that I've prepared. Here's the book itself. I don't know, do we want to look at that? Daniela has her copy. Here's another copy. I can pass this around. Whoa, no, I can't. And if anyone is interested, this is the anthology, which part of it is open source, so you can get the introduction and the final chapter that way if you're interested. Anyway, so book is book. The cover shows a photograph taken by astronauts as they were circling the moon. And I liked it because it shows a kind of ambivalent image. Is the Earth disappearing, or is it just coming around into its own? And my whole book is written kind of that way. It's our choice. Are we going to move forward with sustainability of the planet, or are we going to go down in flames, quite literally? So I wanted this book to present clear kinds of choices, but also a very positive image of what art can do to promote sustainability of the planet by rethinking itself. So that's what this is about. And if you go to this website here, you will get a remastered recording of the astronauts in their capsule when they were taking this photograph. And it's really quite fun. They were scrambling to get the right film and the right camera before the space capsule turned around and it was out of view. So that's how I came to that cover. And then if you follow it, in the book itself, there's discussion, pages 7 and 8. And at that point, there's a little critique of the blue marble mentality that says you can't take a picture of the blue marble because it's all unified, and actually our planet is not very unified at all. So it gives you a kind of a wormhole view into the argument of the book. And the whole book is a little bit playful that way. I will show you the table of contents. It has a second subtitle, 5 Fugues on the Future of the Past. It's organized in 5 chapters with little thematic essays in between. And then I've included something I call text boxes, which are short visual essays. There's one devoted to Daniela's current book project on the Codex Mendoza, to give a kind of complement to the more abstract argument in the main text and also to flesh it out. So if I'm talking about Eurocentrism, how we got into this pickle and how we looked at objects, then the text box, like Daniela's, will say, and here's how we're rethinking that material evidence and recovering the indigenous contribution to this complex scholarship, for example. by looking closely at the material evidence. So the main focus of, now I'm going to start this paper part of this. The main focus of writing Borderless Histories of Art concerns the historical relationship between European assumptions about art and society and the degradation of the environment on a global scale. Between 1900 and 2015, humans destroyed more than 80% of major mammal species populations on the planet. Given that about 70% of wild animal populations have also been wiped out since 1970, with another million species of plants and animals under threat of extinction and the unprecedented rate of decline accelerating, discussions about the sustainability of life on our planet cannot be limited to what is presumed best for humanity. In a matter of centuries, humans are also destroying billions of years of accumulated resources and destabilizing the biosphere. For such a civilization to survive, Earth system scientists argue that humans must sustain and foster planetary habitability by viewing themselves as an integral and responsible part of a planetary system. Before I go further, I should tell you that many of the screens have writing that I'm not going to actually read out loud. They're meant, like the text box, as a kind of complement to the main argument. So, no, let me go back. Let me go back here. So my book and my talk today reflect on the historical idea of human exceptionalism as it is interwoven with the discourse on art. Writing Borderless Histories of Art offers a deterritorialized model for organizing artifactual history. It is neither a history of ideas nor a search for the origins of art history, but a recognition of the structures that drive its narratives. I offer a thought experiment in the form of an intradisciplinary collaborative project aimed at conceiving a pluriversal history of planetary culture that all living creatures and environments share. Not to replace art history, but as a contribution to a dynamic discipline that is constantly reworking its foundations. The argument is organized into 5 fugues and 3 connecting intermezzos in keeping with the musical metaphor of fugues. I named the chapter essays fugues for 2 reasons. First, because a fugue is a decentered European musical form in which the subject is introduced in one part and then repeated and explored in the others until all the parts are interwoven. That describes the organization of my chapters individually and collectively. My second reason for naming the chapters fugues derives from its other, much darker meaning in psychiatry to define a, quote, a state or period of loss of awareness of one's identity, often coupled with flight from one's usual environment. The utterly devastating psychological condition of fugue describes metaphorically, and in many cases literally, the widespread and ever-growing humanitarian crisis. In today's world, refugees fleeing destruction of their besieged homelands correspond to the sacrificial victim in the fatal and exclusionary sense described by philosopher Giorgio Agamben as those whom the state defines as excluded from the human world. Non-human animals are also excluded from the world increasingly reserved only for certain privileged humans and their domesticated pets and food animals. What justifies such blatant disregard for life on our planet? If the short answer is unregulated capitalism in bed with feckless government officials and inadequate national and international laws and regulations, the longer answer is rooted in the Western metaphysical theory of knowledge that distinguishes between humans and all other animals for their ability to think, their ability to invent, their ability to master nature. The Oxford Dictionary of Environment and Conservation defines human exceptionalism as a paradigm based on the view that humans are different from all other organisms, that all human behavior is controlled by culture and free will, and that all problems can be solved by human ingenuity and technology. The idea that humans are exceptional was initially articulated in Aristotle's account of the difference between human and animal powers of discursive reasoning and inventive capacities to utilize nature. This understanding of humans' unique mental, technological, and artistic abilities runs through the entire Western discourse on art. Today we know that some kinds of animals pass on their learned behavior, mourn their dead, nurture and teach their children, even use human language to communicate, not just to parrot words, and engage in many other remarkable behaviors that research scientists and other careful observers of animals have recorded. Octopuses are sentient. Insects feel, respond to pain, learn from experience, and share their learned knowledge with others. Plants with no apparent nervous system make the same chemicals, serotonin, dopamine, and glutamate, that serve as neurotransmitters and help create mood in animals. The concept of human exceptionalism urgently deserves to be rethought. Who qualifies as fully human? Who is in a position of authority to judge? This is the first photo in my book. It was taken by an octopus of Craig Foster, whose film My Octopus Teacher won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 2021. Foster was filming creatures living in the great African sea forest off the coast of South Africa in 2023, when a young octopus grabbed his camera, zoomed backward across the ocean floor, and began filming videos of her own graceful arms draped over the camera lens with his awkward body, all limbs in the background. Not that we can get to the intentionality of how this photo came to be, but I offer it as a kind of a provocation to open my book. I adopt the concept of post-human and more than human to broaden the scope of what it means to be treated as a valued life form. The advantages of such an ecological approach to conceptualizing the study of culture stems from its ability to institute a more pluralistic historical vision at any scale of study that considers different signifying systems, worldviews, and contexts of use on equal footing. Shifting people's mindset is key to mitigating the climate crisis. The arts and humanities are in a strong position to help scientists make their case, and we have a responsibility to do so. The historical idea of human exceptionalism is interwoven with the discourse on art. In my book, I discuss in detail how the classification of the arts since the 16th century was a significant factor in amplifying long-standing neo-Aristotelian notions of human exceptionalism by claiming that humans are not only superior to animals in their cognitive abilities, but entire groups of people are superior to other groups, based on the assumption that it is possible to judge the mentality not only of individuals but of entire societies by examining their shared cultural practices, their arts. In fact, human exceptionalism and racial thinking are two facets of the same Aristotelian legacy. My research examined the early period of contact between Spain and the Americas, when ecclesiastical writers applied Aristotle's arguments about certain humans being slaves by nature to Amerindian peoples. The arts, techne, broadly defined by Aristotle in the Politics to include all things created to adapt the environment to man's special needs, required the exercise of individual judgment and played a crucial role in defining the humanity of Amerindian peoples. In the Politics, Aristotle also defined a kind of slave by nature, which refers not to an institutionalized practice, but to a category of humans who are unable to govern themselves because, he claimed, they have failed to achieve proper mastery over their passions. Such creatures have the ability to deliberate, so they're capable of following instructions, but they do not possess true reason and are incapable of practical wisdom, quote unquote, which issues commands. Theologians, jurists, missionaries applied Aristotle's hypothetical arguments to the existence of natural slaves to actual Amerindian peoples in various ways, ranging from wholesale acceptance to wholesale rejection. But whatever position individual authors took, the discourse developed within this frame of reference. To understand the emancipatory potential of this entangled colonial and colonialist discourse continuing over many generations, this history is crucial. The third fugue of my book proposes that climate theory played a key role in European discourse on art before art was defined in modern terms as the object of individual secular aesthetic contemplation. That's climate theory from ancient Mediterranean texts that were very popular in the 16th century and on. Macro-environmental theories that connect the nature of individuals to their environments appear in numerous genres and contexts based on a wide range of sources. This would be the most familiar, these kinds of cultural geographies, of which this is a fantastic early example, hand-colored etching showing different cities of the world lined up together as if they were all the same, with certain categories being presented. Some of you might already be familiar with this. This kind of production continued medieval ideas of monsters being at the edge of the world, which is what we see in this very famous so-called Nuremberg Chronicle, published in 1493, where these strange creatures, monsters, are at the edge of the world. And you can see it being adapted and changed as time goes on, and different people were doing different kinds of explorations and bringing back different information. And I just show it to you just to give you a visual reference point for my argument. What we now call cultural geography refers to accounts of how place and climate shape mind, body, and the character of human beings, and the organization and development of human societies. In the period sources, they're often called cosmographies. Despite semantic shifts in the meaning of the term, climate theory, as this literature was known in the 19th century, offers a convenient shorthand today to describe a wide range of ancient ideas often employed in some combination by early modern writers. Even as the details changed, as ancient Mediterranean climate theories were reappraised in light of new empirical evidence, the understanding that geographical location and climate determine the character and capabilities of peoples established the framework for discussing differences of genius at the collective level in Europe beginning in the 16th century. Anne Lara Stoller's strategy of seeking correlations among constellations of concepts rather than comparisons or causes offers a useful methodological tool. It allows for the juxtaposition of different genres and contexts of discussion, ranging from cultural geographies to political theory to natural philosophy and anatomy, from medical and juridical records and colonial questionnaires to writings for and against chattel slavery. My argument focuses on the role of ingenuity in historical climate theory. I show in detail how the assumptions of historical theories of climate led directly to biological theories of race. The discussion turns to Kant's account of aesthetic judgment in Fugue 3 and continues with Darwin's account of human evolution in Fugue 4 to locate their ideas in relation to the long dynamic history of climate theory. I argue that what has not been studied and is crucial to conceiving an ecological approach to the history of art and material culture is the significant role played by the concept of inventiveness and moral character in accounts of human difference at the collective level. Taking counterexamples from indigenous ontologies and epistemologies, the fifth fugue draws this book to a close by advocating a topological network or diagrammatic model of distributed agency to steer clear of Western dualistic metaphysical ontology built into the foundation of the modern discipline of art history. I suggest a non-totalizing transcultural approach to the study of material culture beyond the parameters of any single discipline to consider planetary habitability. Why does it matter now that the foundational arguments and categories for the modern discursive category of art were not secular, even when they were based on ancient sources like Aristotle's Politics? The discourse was driven by institutional Catholicism, Catholic and Protestant monarchs, and economic globalization. Concepts of art, of being human, of who is considered human, and how to relate to each other as humans mutually defined one another over several centuries. My point is not that the arguments derive from Aristotle or other ancient Greco-Roman sources. My point is about the new uses to which ancient Mediterranean Aristotelian arguments were put in the 16th century and well beyond. And the question worth asking, in my opinion, is not about source criticism or how the past led to the present, but how imagining the future differently can lead us to rethinking the unrecognized past in the present. The ever-expanding applications of ancient authority for classifying humans and all other animals served as a major source of distinctions between biology and culture for centuries. therefore of central relevance to contemporary efforts to transcend dualistic modes of thinking, such as the categorical distinction between nature and culture itself, grounded in Western metaphysics. Until quite recently, most philosophers in the Western tradition maintained the old Aristotelian distinction that humans have certain capacities denied to all animals. The contemporary reference point is frequently Heidegger's 1929 claim that the stone is worldless, the animal poor in world, and the human world-forming or world-building. The same neo-Aristotelian history of human exceptionalism forms the implicit ground of Heidegger's widely influential distinctions between what it means to be human and what it means not to be human. Among contemporary philosophers who have questioned the legitimacy of Heidegger's contention that only humans form worlds, the towering figure is Jacques Derrida. Derrida's life work can be described succinctly as an ongoing and wide-ranging critique of structural unity and authorial genesis. Derrida's last books and seminars trained this mode of critique on the Heideggerian claim that only the human has a relationship to death as such, while animals simply perish. The question of the animal was central to his thinking throughout his career, but at the time he was preparing these writings and presenting them in seminars, Derrida was suffering from the pancreatic cancer that took his life. In the posthumously published book entitled The Animal That Therefore I Am, Derrida asks, with characteristic mix of wry wit and intellectual rigor, what logic generates the limit between man with a capital M and animal with a capital A? Derrida offers a prime lesson in borderless thinking about humanness. The issue is not that the distinction between human and animal can ever be eliminated, Derrida writes. Its existence is so widely attested in the history of Western thought that to make such a claim would be bestial, stupid, undercutting the claim being made for human intelligence. We can instead recognize in this pair of categories the values the humans invented to define themselves in distinction from every other creature. The categories themselves are not mutually exclusive. One is not exterior to the other, because each one comprises a heterogeneous multiplicity of the living. There are many kinds of animals, including humans linked into the archaic human past, many kinds of cultural artifacts, and their coexistence is always embedded in a multitude of contexts that become meaningful only in relation to events. A borderless approach to art and other forms of cultural history in this sense of questioning inherited structures encourages conceptualizing the transformation of things through shifts in time and space. That is, a borderless approach is focused on the changeability of things and the instability of their signifying power. In his larger argument, Derrida does not proceed as the scientists have in documenting cognitive abilities and behaviors in animals that were formerly ascribed only to humans. Derrida takes the opposite tack of observing humanity's lack of rationality and abundance of animalistic traits, including his own possible lapse into bestial behavior, where he simply denied the existence of the categories themselves. Derrida practices a deadly serious, playful strategy by reaching into the abyss to breach the flimsy wall that humans maintain between themselves and all other animals. To which we might add, the implication for writing responsibly about the history of art and culture in an expanded field is that we need to value narratives of identity that connect humans to the rest of the planet instead of positioning ourselves as detached observers. Why would a broadly conceived, inclusive history of planetary culture be desirable now? Taking responsibility in the age of capital, as I've titled my introduction, entails a fundamental rethinking of the nature-culture divide itself. The discourse on art was involved in debates on the humanity of indigenous peoples that began with the European conquest invasion of the Americas in the early 16th century. Art was held to be a distinguishing feature of humanity based on a parallel between human reasoning and nature established 2,500 years ago in ancient Greek philosophy. This account of humans as exceptions to the rest of nature runs through the entire Western tradition, but it was particularly important in establishing the idea that mentality and cultural production are directly linked, that one represents the other. Drawing upon a wide range of modern disciplinary practices, writing Borderless Histories of Art examines how expanding applications of ancient authority for classifying humans developed alongside the extraction of raw materials and the degradation of the environment in the Americas since the beginning of the 16th century. The ethical responsibility of humans as caretakers, not overlords of our planet, underscores the urgent need to discredit mounting violent, xenophobic, and identitarian understandings of humanity that increase the existential threats to the planet in many ways. What matters crucially are the values that we instill along with the subject matter. Writing Borderless Histories of Art looks to the emancipatory potential of our colonialist histories and offering a thought experiment aimed at conceiving planetary culture without constructing a totalizing narrative of any kind. Ongoing research and thinking in many different fields emphasize that the ontological divisions between the domains of the human and all other animals and between the social and the biological are fluid. Instead of redrawing the opposition between innate capacity, biology, and acquired content, culture, writes social anthropologist Tim Ingold, a new sociobiological synthesis is needed to describe the way all creatures understand through processes of growth and discovery forged in the crucible of their common life. The negative effect of humans as geologic agents is a shared catastrophe we have inherited. It is not simply of our own making or lifetime, but the misery is not distributed equally around the planet. An approach to art informed by the entangled history of capitalism, environmental degradation, and human rights encourages conceptualizing the changeability of things and the instability of their signifying power in this double sense. The history of the European concept of European exceptionalism needs to be viewed in a transcultural and transdisciplinary framework broad enough to include the historical discourse on techne in order to understand the economic practices and that eco-critics like Jason Moore, Donna Haraway, Bruno Latour, and many others identify as the principal drivers of the climate crisis. It would be far too reductive to say that categories of thinking are the root cause of poorly regulated capitalism, but they are co-constructions enabling one another. I want to stress how differently science understands biological identity now from the epistemological model on which the discipline of art history was built. The biological conceptualization of identity today undoes the premise of the universal white Western male subject by recognizing multiplicity in the record of human existence. In the 19th century, all the social sciences relied on models of evolution that stressed the interconnectedness of life in terms of the anatomy of individual organisms, whereas the current scientific understanding of evolution defines identity at the molecular level. A very different model of biological identity has been established by the genetic science of genomics, beginning with the discovery in 1953 that the DNA molecule exists in the form of a double helix. The subsequent sequencing of entire human genomes, the first of which was published in 2001, changed the way modern science thinks about biological identity, individually and collectively. The implications of ongoing DNA analysis are far from settled. New evidence is emerging every day, and there are many valid reasons to criticize how genome analysis was initially based on the problematic assumption that a white male individual or a composite of white male individuals, subjects, could provide a universal model. In recent years, indigenous scholars and policy advocates have articulated a host of ethical issues regarding exploitation and objectification by more powerful groups, scientists, colonial universities, federally funded researchers, against less powerful humans, indigenous peoples, which maintains a colonial structure of knowledge production. With these important caveats in mind, there are still valid reasons for referring to genetic science in thinking about cultural memory on a planetary scale. The new DNA evidence of ancient human populations irrefutably shows that there was never a single trunk population in the human past. Some claims are deeply controversial, but the new science of ancient genetics is currently able to demonstrate that we are all blends of past populations. There is no pure lineage of Homo sapiens. Humans from different populations interbred extensively with each other. Modern humans also bred successfully with archaic humans. Given the indisputable findings of intermixing populations, where and how should the boundaries of human culture be drawn in our histories? The analysis of ancient DNA adds considerable complexity to the question of how human traits have evolved. Homo sapiens interbred with other humans that produced fertile offspring. The new understanding of human evolution puts into question the modern category species used to distinguish Homo sapiens from archaic humans. Archaic humans made stone tools, cared for the sick and elderly, made jewelry with symbolic associations 130,000 years ago, constructed stone circles in caves 180,000 years ago, and left other material evidence of their cultural activities before and after they interacted with Homo sapiens. At sites in southwestern Europe and southern Italy, modern human-style tools have been found in the midst of Neanderthal remains dated 44 to 39,000 years ago, suggesting some kind of direct cultural interaction took place. The analysis of whole genomes also shows that people who live in a particular place today almost never exclusively descend from the people who lived there in the past. So this is always changing, but in my book I reproduce these archaic human tools dating from about 400,000 years before the present on the left. And this, at the moment, this warty hog facing two other pigs in a cave in Indonesia is at least 45,500 years before Christ. So rather than having French and Spanish cave paintings be the beginning of art history in a different way of thinking relationally, lots of different places produced art very early on. Right now this is the oldest, but new finds are always coming up. So it's not meant to be a definitive argument about origins, but an argument about relationality across the planet. In the 1980s, Homi Bhabha introduced the concept of culturally hybrid literature, and since then the term hybrid has been applied to images and artifacts of all kinds to designate certain kinds of culturally complex objects. Bhabha repurposed the 19th century racial term hybridity as a problematic of colonial representation that results when colonial subjects mimic the forms of the dominant culture, but articulate those forms with differential knowledges and positionalities that threaten normalized knowledge and disciplinary power. However, as others have pointed out, notably Latin Americanist art historians dealing with culturally complex works of art produced in colonial settings, there are many problems with using the term hybrid in the material register, ranging from its overemphasis on visual appearances, the visual actually occludes as much as it reveals, to the implication that some prior purity exists, a hangover from its past as a racial designation. However, with the unprecedented findings of ancient genome sequencing, science provides a model of collective identity that supports the critique introduced by Bhabha and developed by many other post-colonial theorists. Homo sapiens are mixtures all the way through the record of human existence and into the proto-human past. It is now possible to conceive an artifactual history of the planet in terms that are radically different from the taxonomic efforts of 19th century scholars who isolated objects from their context of making and use and redefined them on European terms, a process already evident in the 16th century. How material things come to have significance and how the same object or concrete manifestation can have multiple meanings for its users is one of the main ways that the study of art can make significant theoretical contributions to the ongoing debates about the relationship of humans to the rest of nature. Works of art and other cultural artifacts are irreducibly multivalent. That is, all images and all material things by their nature refuse absolute meaning. Images and objects with multiple cultural resonances are not necessarily synthetic products of cultural interaction either. In fact, as Baba insisted in the case of literature, they often mean one thing to one person or group and something quite different to other users. One of the most difficult lessons to unlearn is the logic of representational knowledge. It is one of the main challenges facing critical approaches to the planetary history of art and material culture. The entrenched idea that art represents something absent from but implied in the material object. Instead, we can imagine a non-totalizing approach to the planetary history of all material artifacts and their performative context, broadly conceived to focus on process rather than taxonomy. An adequate ecological approach to the history of planetary culture needs to be framed with collaborative, intergenerational processes in mind, without setting humans apart from the rest of nature, of the natural world, or conflating biological identity with cultural identity on a one-to-one basis, as racial theories of cultural evolution have in the past. Mapped as structures of connectivity, the deep history of human development and migration on the one hand, and the circulation of cultural artifacts on the other, are both open-ended, branching, rhizomatic structures spreading in many directions without top or bottom or boundaries. Human traits are dynamic and derive from the complex intersections of multiple genes with their natural and cultural environment. There is no basis for positing a one-to-one relationship between cultural and biological identity indebted to 19th century theories of evolution on which art history was founded and still largely operates. Biological identity operates at the molecular level of DNA, while cultural identity operates at the level of objects and practices. Even when the genetic and artifactual evidence corroborate one another, the correlation is strictly circumstantial. Human genome variation supplements the traditional toolkit of archaeology, but because it is often impossible to distinguish between genetic and cultural factors in the material record, collaboration between historians and biologists is imperative, even and especially when genetic scientists find themselves in the domain of history, interpreting skeletal remains for the signs of cultural identity. The correlation between genetic and cultural identity must be determined from the material record on a case-by-case basis. To think in concrete detail at any scale of study on any subject according to the porous dynamic connectivities that historically developed on our planet, while insisting on non-essentializing dynamic transcultural approaches, also makes it possible to defamiliarize European conceptions of art, to think its history anew. Oh, there is a missing slide. I don't know where it went. It's okay. We will just go back to no visuals. Aristotle's distinction between humans and non-human animals based on cognitive differences is the theory of human exceptionalism at the root of Western metaphysics, but it is not upheld by recent science. In fact, just the opposite. With recent developments in animal behavioral science, the importance of social learning, inventiveness, innovation, adaptation, and other patterns of behavior resulting from interactions between animals and their environment have become the focus of evolutionary theory. Behavioral scientists are studying how learned behavior has a genetic impact through natural selection. When studied in detail, many patterns of behavior are found to be complex products of several types of intelligence. Behavioral scientists Eitan Avital and Eva Jabonka make a case for animal culture by highlighting important general differences between genetic and cultural transmission. They define culture as social traditions and how those traditions are passed on. As long as we refrain from defining consciousness on exclusively human terms, marine biologist and ecologist Carl Safina argues, extensive evidence indicates widespread consciousness in the animal kingdom, and in some cases, the overlap between animal and human intelligence is astounding. So that image that I showed at the beginning, that's at the beginning of my book, was made by the octopus of the documentary filmmaker, somewhat after this film. But I thought maybe you'd like to watch a little bit of this film now, with the ideas that I have just been talking about the continuity of intelligence and art-making practices focused on event and activities. So this is Craig Foster swimming with his octopus that he watched for. How many of you are already familiar with octopus? I would say most people are. How many of you have not seen the film before? Okay, well that's good too. So this is at the beginning of the film. He's swimming with the octopus that he made friends with for a year and dove every single day for a year, and that's the life cycle of an octopus, this kind of octopus, is about a year. Should add, Craig Foster can hold his breath for 6 minutes, and he's swimming in frigid 45-degree water. And he's doing both of those things so he can be close to the octopus, and he was already a filmmaker before he started this project. So I thought the reason for showing this is to think about art making as improvisational judgment. And maybe most fundamentally, it's a survival instinct. Definitely the role of art today in our very fragile ecosystem is essential for survival. So that's the heavy, ponderous moral message underlying this. But otherwise, we tend to think of this sculpture that the octopus made as being the artwork. But it's not. It's really that whole event, everything that was happening before and after. And this may look like the artwork to us, and it is quite an amazing little thing that he saw the first time that he went looking for an octopus. So what if the connectivity of all life, rather than human exceptionalism, were taught as part of the general curriculum in the humanities? Human exceptionalism is the problem regarding unregulated economic globalization and the climate crisis, no matter how it is construed, and the cure, insofar as there is one, lies elsewhere. Many indigenous cosmologies or knowledge systems do not distinguish between the sentience of humans and other animals and conceive of both within the environment. Claims with direct implications for current efforts launched from many different starting points to think about the ways that humans are entailed with their environments. In fact, all creatures learn through processes of growth and discovery entailed with their environments. Affordances, a term coined by perceptual psychologist James Gibson in 1966, refers to the complementarity of the individual animal and the environment. An affordance is what an environment offers to an animal in pursuit of its tasks of life, and one cannot exist without the other. Thinking in terms of affordances can help us imagine an ecological approach to the history of art and all cultural practices that does not entail situating humans in a sovereign position apart from the natural world. Taking Gibson's ecological approach one step forward, anthropologist Tim Ingold also argues that his principle of affordances still treats the environment as offering objective properties that do not, after all, depend on the presence of the animal for their existence. Ingold advocates for the role of ontogenesis, quoting him, that is, the growth and development of the organism in its environment in the evolution of forms of life, end quote. It takes generations working together to produce the conditions on which the continued existence of a given lineage collectively depends. Life is forged in the collaboration of overlapping generations within the matrix, not successive generations isolated like sheets in a stack of papers. The material world is neither formed nor formless, but always in the process of formation. Matter, as physicist Karen Barad puts it, does not consist of little bits of nature passively awaiting signification. Matter is always in the process of becoming. One of the principal aims of current research to develop non-totalizing transcultural approaches to historically documented relationships that rethink how specific technologies of making are interrelated in economic, philosophical, social, and political terms. How do materials and technologies signify? What do they signify, and to whom, When and where, under what conditions do they carry meaning? To what extent should we as scholars, scientists, cultural critics, students, actually everyone operating in today's social networks, take responsibility for the effects of the knowledge we produce? Historians of art in all forms of culture have the expertise to contribute to an unprecedented planetary consciousness of who we are, where we came from, and where we are going in the era of climate and ecosystem emergency. It is important to understand inherited epistemological categories and their ontological premises because they shape our thought almost without our knowing it. Certain indigenous people who hold on to an ontology of animism, once a marker distinguishing savages from civilized people, are now recognized for rejecting entrenched divisions between the biological and the social realms. The critical question has always been how to define the relationship between culture and nature, or, as Engel proposes and future artifactual histories of the planet might call it, socio-becomings that bring the social and the biological together in a single frame. Imagine how an ecological account of the history of culture that included all life could support efforts to create conditions of sustainability on the planet we share. The importance of social learning, inventiveness, innovation, adaptation, and other patterns of behavior resulting from interactions between animals and their environment is once again the focus of theory. Studying the knowledge utilized in making things has broad implications for thinking transculturally about knowledge and technology as open systems for understanding the natural world. This brings me to the parallel project that is also a continuation of my monograph that I mentioned at the beginning as the outgrowth of a conference on the international history of art on the theme of motion and migration that had to be postponed because of the pandemic, migrating viruses. So this is where that missing frame went. So following my theoretical introduction for this book, the jacket you see on the right that I also passed around, 10 chapters are juxtaposed to emphasize points of connectivity between unrelated case studies, and the 4 parts of the book highlight different types of issues and methodologies. We read Ingold together, that brings coherence to this volume, and another theoretical thinker from South America, Viveros de Castro, on modern efforts to dispose of dualism, which only create monism, that is, the denial of dualism. Comparability is not translatability, he writes. His idea of creative misunderstanding, the failure to understand that understandings are not necessarily the same. They are related to the real world, not to imaginary ways of seeing the world. My co-editor, Jens Baumgarten, who was paired with me for this conference as the Brazilian counterpart, made this nice chart when we gave a book talk in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago, which might be useful to all of you, trying to think about these heuristic categories that we use as heuristic. They're not written in stone. They're ways of thinking differently about the histories that we have inherited, and it's now our responsibility to take it to the next place. So what happens? And this anthology has a coda, which is a transcribed conversation among the 3 editors. We met about every 2 weeks for several years, and we had fantastic discussions as we were developing this project. And one of the foundational questions that we asked that opens this coda: what happens when different signifying practices collide and transform one another? And we wanted to create a dialogical space in the volume and in our conversation as well. So Susan asks, what can art historians do to make structural change happen within the discipline of art history? She's a specialist on Australian Indigenous art and has worked closely with Indigenous communities for decades. She prefers to take art history out of the museum, out of the books, and into the field. Why is it important for the institution of art history to prioritize Indigenous voices? What other terms besides art can we come up with? Artisanal epistemology is not meant as a contrast to scientific epistemology and artistic epistemology. It's meant to be broad enough, but without being totalizing, to be capacious enough to encompass everything that has to do with making things, making as art, its most basic idea. But as a discursive category, art can refer to a thing or event, but it's always driven by context. The changing the discourse by understanding the history of our assumptions is imperative. That's one of our main points in this anthology as well. And we also discussed the problem of English as a lingua franca, how easy for us that everything is in English, but that's not true. It was certainly not true for Jens, who is German and has been teaching in Portugal for at least 2 decades. Objectivity is only possible through the joining of partial views into a collective subject position that creates communities based on concrete circumstances. That fundamental idea from Donna Haraway was fundamental for my book, but also for this anthology, and I think for a lot of things moving forward. Susan offered this, and that another view of this same project became the cover of our book. So Megan Cope is an Indigenous Australian artist, and for her artwork, she photographs and makes these oyster beds that reclaim oysters. So one oyster bed at a time, she's helping the local ecology where she lives. And then she offered us her photographs and permission to use them without charge. And in exchange, Susan has volunteered to go help her make some new oyster beds, so we hope that that comes to pass. One of the primary vulnerabilities faced by the social sciences and the humanities is the fragmentation of knowledge into highly specialized disciplinary formations. It is imperative to define an enunciative network, to borrow Michel Foucault's formulation, much broader than any discipline established in the 19th century, because their epistemological claims inevitably rest on grounds obscured by their differentiation as distinct subjects of study. Eco-critics routinely point to the 17th century European scientific and philosophical literature as a source of Eurocentric binary of nature and culture. I argue that human exceptionalism is not solely the product of 17th century secular philosophy. Human exceptionalism runs through the entire history of Western thought. At the same time, Anthropocene's origins are important today because, in the words of contemporary art historian T.J. Demos, they are, quote, inextricable from early modern globalization, practiced through resource extraction, military conquest, and culture-erasing colonialism, end quote. Connections between foundational critiques of disciplinarity as such and the concrete project of critiquing a given disciplinary practice are often obscure. It may be one thing to critically assess practices that conform to existing disciplinary expectations, but it is often quite another to question the configuration itself. In conclusion, I want to emphasize a methodological consideration. It is not at all exceptional for modern scholars to focus on what is most advanced and still tenable in their inherited texts while ignoring the rest. However, this approach leaves the dualistic structure of inclusion-exclusion in place while excluding the role of art in establishing those same boundaries. If the objective is to rethink the nature-culture divide, it is imperative to recognize the occluded arguments as part of the process of coming to terms with Eurocentrism. The specter is invisible in the mirror, as Derrida put it, and this condition can either haunt us in the manner of the ghost of Hamlet's father, reminding us that time is out of joint, or we can remember our past, learn from it in the present, and use the lessons to devise a better future. That's it. Thank you.
Either way, whatever you prefer. Well, whatever. Questions? Eve.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. That was really interesting. I had a question about the form of your project and I guess the idea of history or discourses and how that sort of fits into your work. At the beginning of your talk, you sort of make this statement about your project, that it's sort of a history of all of the possible actors in this sort of cultural biological field, right? That includes non-humans and all different humans, right?
It's a thought experiment.
Yeah, I was wondering if this project made you think differently about history or the usefulness of history or why a history is a form that this project could take, right? Like, certainly some animals may or may not have a conception of history, but I would tend to think that even in our human culture that there is a thing called history that we care about or do is a contingent cultural construction in and of itself. So it seems to me that that would probably also be the case in the animal realm, right? And so I guess I'm just wondering, how do you see history as a concept serving the project, and how did this project make you think differently about what history is or can do?
Oh, great question. So how does history serve this project, and how can we think differently about history through this project? So I'm not suggesting that animals do history or even that other cultures. So one thing is to relativize our disciplinary practices. So what we call history or what we call theory might be the making of baskets or the carrying out of initiation rites or many, many other things. As far as animals having history, well, they're not interested in writing books so much, but some animals have, like elephants, have an enormous memory, very, very stereotypically. They have great memories, but they do. And they remember social relationships for many, many years. And they have emotional bonds. So in terms of incorporating animals into a history of planetary culture, I think there would be many different ways that one could go about it without forcing the issue. And nor do I think that history is the be-all or end-all, but as I argued throughout, if we don't understand our categories and where they come from, then we don't understand the basis for our knowledge, and then we're just haunted by it, it's stereotyped or shackled by it, because we don't really understand what the terms of our own arguments are. So this is coming out of my some 30 years of looking at the history of Western ideas of art and the broad spectrum of sources on which initially my work on Leonardo da Vinci was based. And that's what I'm thinking. But this is not prescriptive. It's meant to make you think, hopefully meant to make you act, maybe think differently about your own projects. Think about how ecological, environmental things can come into play. So one of the big shocks to me when I was working on this project about 6 months before I finished writing was the discovery that what I've been so blandly calling cultural geographies, and I knew they were Eurocentric for their categories of what counts as other people's culture, and if you don't fit those categories, then that part disappears. But it's actually much more insidious than that, because they also have this climate theory, hierarchical notions of climate theory, that people in Asia are despotic, people in Europe are what, this and that. So those kinds of stereotypes go through the literature, and modern scholars often just say, well, that's obviously not true, or we're just going to forget it. But it's actually fundamental to the whole epistemology. So that's what I'm saying, we need to pay attention to that. And we're still wanting to do climate theory, and we're still wanting to think about the environment being entailed with people. That's really central to my whole project. But think about it carefully and unpack the categories of thinking along with it. And that was a problem with a few people really understand that Darwin still maintained a Christian hierarchy of humans. He didn't think that humans evolved, because once they were inventive, they could change their environments. And he adopted a Christian theory of the hierarchy of creatures, and he was so focused on getting his theory of evolution accepted that he used the long-standing primitive to civilized category for savages that were in between modern humans and animals. And that way of thinking really held up evolutionary theory based on genetics for a very long time, because it was totally based on climate theory. And I could go on, but that's the kind of discovery that I made. And so I guess I'm just recommending that we all look carefully at our sources beyond, the box, beyond the box.
I have a question about, well, I'll just ask it. But thank you so much for the talk. My question is, what role does visual analysis have in your conception of borderless histories of art, if any? Perhaps it doesn't have any.
Oh, it has a lot. It just, we have to be careful not to draw a connection between the way things look, their formal qualities, and the mentality of the people who made them, because that's what art history is kind of based on. So you have to look carefully. I mean, that's one of the ways that art historians can make a huge contribution, because we are trained very carefully to look very carefully and to create histories that are founded on that concrete evidence. But just be careful that you don't, I have a chapter on that, on how we got to the 19th century idea that what you make is a direct reflection of your mentality. And the worst of that is thinking collectively. So individuation is one thing. One reason that connoisseurship works is that it does individuate one person from another. But when you expand that to create homogeneous abstract categories and then classify the French as being French and the Germans as being German and all of that, that's when the problems start. That's a great question.
Can I ask you, Claire? I think it sort of follows on these two questions. Given your background as an educator and the fact that we have a lot of students here, what would because you talked a lot about the concepts behind your book and the theories that helped you both challenge what you see as where art history comes from, but also suggests new possibilities. What would this look like? If you can give us some example, like if one of the students leaves and is like, yes, I'm going to write a borderless history of art for my dissertation. Help us see what that might look like.
Well, that's really, I'm so glad, because pedagogy was the beginning of this project. So before I ever took this on around 2010, I decided to redo the foundational course that we offered to 400 students at the University of Colorado. I was so tired of retraining my students once they got to me that no, there isn't French art that's French and all of that stuff that I just started to talk about. That I put together first an undergraduate seminar on the idea of art, and all they had to do was to have taken the traditional foundation course. And we already had a world art course, but really the rest of the world was kind of decoration on the European art history. And the second thing is that I got some grants for my students to work as research assistants, and some of the students from that course and also my graduate students, we put together a collectively taught course that I then taught for the first time around, in which instead of having a foundation that was chronological and based on style and geography, we started with critical concepts, and we started with the watershed change in art history around 1970 or so, when cultural history and feminism first made its appearance and changed that Kenneth Clark way of thinking about great civilizations forever. So we started with that, with the historical grounding, and also with historical museum practices, and how the early collecting practices developed. And the whole first semester was without any kind of chronology at all. And the second semester was organized in terms of maritime trading networks. And so that allowed me to get both detailed case studies and broad overviews. And it wasn't just the maritime trading network that organized this world system. It was also all the land routes in between. So a lot of history got done that way. And so there were a lot of exercises and projects, all of which were looking at topological approaches to art history. So we didn't have that surface and deep structure of form and matter, mentality, and cultural product together. One of the more successful beginning projects was Timothy Brooks's Vermeer's Hat, because he's looking at, you know that book? It's a wonderful book. He takes 5 paintings by Vermeer, and he asks, so where did the things that the people are wearing in this painting come from? And he takes the beaver hat and said, well, beavers have been over-culled in Europe, so Europeans were looking for new sources of beaver. And he ties this to the exploration and looking for the Northwest Passage and meeting different people and getting new beaver skins and all of that. So it's completely on the surface. There's no deep structure at all. It's all cultural history. It's all about this thing was connected with this other thing, and this was connected with this other thing. And that way you get in and out of the painting. You're not just stuck with this box of painting. And of course, my beginning students didn't have the historical background that a sinologist has. So I asked them to think about what you would do. Pick a project, model it on the Vermeer project, and think about how you would develop this. That's where I can help. So how would you develop it without knowledge and what was left out? Not just what was included, but what was left out. So in terms of case studies, going from the beginning level to the more developed level, I think that's one fruitful way. You have to know a lot about history, and the other thing is that we're all trained in specific fields. So we have to work together. I think faculty have to work across their specializations, just like we have to work across environmental humanities and art history and all of that as well. And I think that could go a long way. I don't believe in assigning projects, but assigning ways of thinking about things. At the graduate level, I've taught a seminar on the idea of history of art as well, and artist ways of knowing. So there are lots of ways that you can get from case studies to larger ways of conceptualizing the project without having to fall back on period style, geographical location. I mean, think, Daniela is one of the leading scholars of Latin American studies in the world, and this is what she does too. So she looks at the object, and she looks at the way it is a point of intersection between different cultural practices and meanings, and unpacks things at the very concrete level. Would that be a fair characterization of how we go about thinking about the circulations and flows of objects and meanings and contexts of use?
I think it's a fair characterization of my work, not of my status, but yes. Amy.
This picks up, well, I guess I want to ask almost a biographical question, intellectual biographical question about, and it's a question also about your relationship to your audience. So what did it feel like to write? What was the experience of writing, reframing the Renaissance in the mid-90s and giving talks like this compared to this experience now with this second book, and there have been books in between, but the second kind of wake-up call and provocation? Did you feel then, do you feel now like your audience is already on board, that you're sort of pulling the rug out from under can you just talk a little bit about the...
Well, that's such a nice question. Yeah, such a nice question. So, reframing the Renaissance, I started that in 1992, at the height of the Columbian quincentenaries. And I had just finished my dissertation on Leonardo da Vinci's writings in defense of the arts, which are the first major contribution to the comparison of the arts. And there were lots of great issues that developed over the next hundreds of years. And I asked myself when that was done, first book, tenure project done, so what was left out? What was left out of the archive? So far, I've been looking at the, now we
Surveillance.
let's just turn it all off. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you.
Goodbye. So, it was a totally different moment. It was the moment of multiculturalism. It was the moment of post-colonial discourse analysis. It was the moment when Edward Said was saying, look at your Eurocentric practices and don't contribute to it. Think differently. Think about what was left out. So it was very joyful in some ways. The University of Colorado was funding projects that were including more diversity and gender analysis. I think I first taught in the classroom reframing the Renaissance. I also came out of the classroom on a Ford Foundation fellowship given to the university for different projects. So at that time, I was very nervous, of course, about how this would be perceived. But also, my press did some promotion. So that's something else that I'm unhappy with, is that presses don't do promotion anymore. So I was very lucky because I got a review by Anthony Grafton in the New York Review of Books that compared Mignolo's Darker Side of the Renaissance to my Reframing the Renaissance. And that really was a boost. So then many people knew about it. And I did give some talks, not a huge number of talks, but everywhere I went, graduate students and young professors, assistant professors were the ones that were the most excited. In my own faculty, there was a lot of pushback. So many years later, when I put that course together that I was describing to Daniela just a minute ago, I maybe had 2 or 3 out of 7 or 8 that were enthusiastic about changing what we already had, and nobody wanted to teach this course. And I got students to work with all the faculty. We put together lecture topics. They came up with the lecture topics. I put them into a syllabus to make some kind of sense. The graduate students worked with each faculty member to get readings and take notes on the readings and put together a website and all kinds of discussion. And that was still a very exciting project. But by the time I came back from a research leave in the 3rd year, so then I didn't institute the course right away, fellowship. But when I came back, they didn't want to teach it. So they handed it off to adjunct faculty that they hired who had no idea why they were not teaching chronology. So some people liked it and other people didn't like it. And after a few years, the whole course was canceled when my idea had been that we would have debriefings every year. And we would share this archive, and the course could be reorganized any way you wanted to, as long as we stuck by the basic course goals that we had arrived at as a group. So I would say that between then and now, things have not gotten better. That was 2010.
Thank you for the lecture. This is somewhat of a theoretical question, and I want to go back to the borderless mentioned in the title of the book. From what I understood, you kind of undertook 2 steps. The first step was to think about the borderlessness in terms of politics, and then the second step, or maybe the first step, or the other step was about thinking about borderlessness between the human and animal borders. So there are kind of 2 borders that are operational. There's the border of politics and the border of species. I was reminded of Derrida's, actually the last seminars that he gave, La Bête et la Souveraine, The Beast and the Sovereign, before he died. And one of the things that he does there is to show how the question of animals, when people see or think about animals, and he's reading Rousseau and so on, is that they kind of, in political systems, reappropriate animal within the political imaginary. Which is to say, fox becomes kind of this image or a character which is kind of snide, and then that has all kind of political connotations and everything. And I bring all of this up just to ask you that even when we think about the human-animal borders or how we pursue animals, it kind of remains so much encoded within this whole formations of politics within which we operate. And if that is the case, what does this kind of abolishing of border between human and animals look like?
So I'm not saying to abolish borders, but to transgress them, to acknowledge them, look at them as historical constructs, and transgress them however one feels that they should be transgressed. So the symbolic value attached to certain animals is always very culturally bound. Thinking about, like, I don't know, Hindu cosmology, there's no border between humans and animals there. And many belief systems don't obey this Western that is dominant. The problem is the dominance of this European mode of thinking. I'm only able to write about this one because this is the one that I've studied. But I encourage others to write from their perspectives of how to think about that human-animal, if that's even the category that you want to be thinking about. Does that address your question at all, or?
Yes, it was a very, very open question.
Yeah.
And it just reminded me of how conception of animals, like you just said, kind of are very much culturally bounded, which is to say, this kind of, the borders itself are kind of shifting borders as we go across.
Shifting borders, and they have histories. So, I mean, I love Derrida's question in that last book about what maintains this border for so many thousands of gazillion years. How come we still have man on one side and a whole rest of creation on the other side? It hasn't been working. This idea that we can solve all problems by our ingenuity, great, we have ingenuity, but look what's happened to the planet now. I mean, Derrida died in 1984. That was a while ago. 2000. 2004, 20 years ago. So things have not gotten better since then in terms of politics or the attention being paid to the sustainability of the planet. But that is still the main existential threat that we face. So we need to change the way that humans and the rest of the animal kingdom are related. That's my most basic point. I'm really an intellectual historian. I study the history of categories more than anything else.
I think we are at time, and I think you should have the last word as you just did. So please join me in thanking.